You can see the embryo of the current institutions. You can see how the thing originated, and what the causes were and what the consequences were. So it's kind of like dealing with the microcosm of the current setup of the current institutions and laws and agencies and all the rest of it. We will focus on, not exclusively, we will focus on the relationship of government and the economy. That's what my major interest in this is. We'll deal with other aspects too, but basically we'll deal with the main thing we'll focus on is how did government intervene and what were the consequences and the causes of the intervention also. Most historians, when they deal with government intervention in the economy, sort of deal with the record of it. I mean, who did what. 1886, the Interstate Commerce Commission was passed, so forth and so on. But not dealing with the consequences. It's sort of like an almanac. Sort of like looking at the almanac saying, well, in 1886, such and such law was passed. Economic historians, if they know in economics, which is not always the case, the problem with economic historians is half of them are historians that don't know any economics, the other half are economists that don't know any history. So that's one of the big problems in the discipline. At any rate, if they know in economics, which some of them do, then they talk about the consequences. What were the consequences of these government interventions, these actions, ICC or whatever? What happened after that? What was the result? What were the consequences, the economic consequences? We'll go into that. We'll also go into a third area, which even fewer people deal with. Namely, why do these interventions, why were they passed? Why do they come about? What were the motivations involved? One of the problems, and it still goes on, by the way, is when they deal with government, they deal with the president, historians, presidents, secretaries of state, secretaries of the treasury, whatever. And they talk about these guys as if they dropped from outer space. In other words, so-and-so became president in 1900, or so-and-so became head of the Interstate Commerce Commission, as if this person had no past, no associations, no nothing. He just becomes there. Joe Zilch becomes president or becomes Secretary of Commerce or whatever. He does some things for 6 or 8 years and he leaves. He drops out of existence. And that's the implicit assumption in most historical record of this stuff. They don't say who these people were. Why? Who were they before? What were they doing before they became president or before they became Secretary of Commerce? What did they do afterward? They had a life before and after. If you examine the lives of these people before and after, you find some interesting things which explain the motivations of many of these interventions, many of the actions they took in office. The problem of motivation, for example, to give a non-economic and a very simple reason here is this. Most people they have economic motivations. I'm not saying economic motivation is the only motivations in political action. What I'm saying is they tend to be hidden. They tend to be covered up. Historians have to work at finding out what they are. For example, to give a very simple example from the news last week. Before the Manus case happened, which of course is a big case in New York City politics, just three days before that, the city council met and was supposed to have, the guy who was supposed to be the chairman of the city council, which is an open spot, was Peter Vallone of Queens. That was sort of the traditional thing. Manhattan and Brooklyn got together, an unholy alliance, whatever you want to call it. Brooklyn democracy, the Brooklyn Democratic Party has been split wide open for many years. They got together for patronage reasons, decided to form an alliance with Manhattan to depose Vallone and not elect them, and elect Sam Horowitz of Brooklyn. There was a big struggle. It was Manhattan and Bronx Manhattan and Brooklyn versus Queens and the Bronx. It was the titanic struggle for power. Now, if everybody stuck with their boroughs, the Manhattan-Brooklyn alliance would have won by 1 vote. A half hour before the vote took place, they took a straw poll in the Manhattan delegation, and the vote was unanimous. It was unanimous in favor of the Manhattan-Brooklyn guy, Horowitz. Okay? A half hour later, they take the real vote, and one guy, Robert Dreyfus in Manhattan, shifts his position, votes for Vallone, and Vallone wins by 1 vote. So then the press asked him, well, why did you change your vote? Okay, what did he say? He didn't say he did it for patronage or committee chairmanship, which he's going to get, and stuff like that. He said, well, first of all, Stanley Friedman, which I thought was the absolute boss of the Bronx Democratic Party, was asked, how will you reward Dreyfus? And he said, with my love. Dreyfus himself was asked, why did you change your vote? And he said, he's sweating, of course, because nobody in the Manhattan delegation still has talked to him to this day. He said, I did it because of my conscience and my duty to my God and my country. Anybody who believes that, has extraordinarily naive. In other words, his official motive, what is he going to say? He did it because he sold out his borough for a committee chairmanship or other patronage. He's not going to say that. He's going to say he did it for my conscience, for the public interest, the general weal, the common good, and all that crap. Okay? Which is what he said. This is an obvious example. It's not always that blatant, but an historian, if I were an historian, if somebody else is a historian writing history of New York City politics and came to this Dreyfus question, he would not simply take Dreyfus's word for it and say, well, Dreyfus said he did it for his God and country. Obviously, you can investigate a little bit deeper. Okay, so this is something historians have to do in general when it comes to economic motivation. We will be doing that. Okay. Excuse me. All right, there's one basic text in this course and two paperbacks, supplementary paperbacks. We had a problem with the text. This is typical, by the way. It was a text I've been using for many years. It was the best economic history book, even though it was quite old. It was being kept in print because it was such a good book. And all of a sudden, as I was told it was in print, I ordered it. In mid-January, they called me up and said, gee, it's out of stock. Gone. So I had to fish around very quickly for a new textbook. I got one, which I without sight unseen, I know the author's a friend of mine, never seen the book. I think it's going to be very good, so we lucked out. Also, it's there, I think it's there in the bookstore, I think. It's Jonathan Hughes. It's called American Economic History. I forget the publisher, but it's a red cover. It's a reddish-brown cover, brownish-red cover. So that's the basic text. Start with I'll explain in a minute. Okay. Then there's two paperbacks. Weinstein paperbacks. The Corporate Ideal in a Liberal State. And Coco, Triumph of Conservatism. Okay, Coco and Weinstein both deal with a very important era, which I'll talk a lot about later on, called the Progressive Era, which essentially, there's some dispute about what the years were, but essentially 1900 and 1917, 1918. That period where most of the current government regulation was launched in almost every field you can think of. So this Progressive Era, Weinstein and Coco both deal with that. Hughes deals with all of American history. We're going to start in the middle of the Civil War, and it deals only a little bit with the Progressive Era, and it fits in nicely here. Civil War to World War I, and then after that we'll get to World War I and both Hughes and Weinstein, and we'll see after that. Start with Hughes. So you don't read Weinstein and Coco until later in the course, till I don't know, about half the course or something, maybe earlier than that. Because that deals with the Progressive period. We're going to begin with the Civil War, which is 1861, 65, and start with Hughes chapter 13 and 14. 13, I think, is the Civil War. 14 is railroads, which is the next thing after the war is Civil War. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to read Hughes chapters 13 to 22. That's the couple hundred pages which start with the Civil War and end with just before World War I, or just with World War I. Then that's the first block of the course. Hughes chapters 13 and 22. Start with 13 and 14, and just keep going. There's no specific assignment for a specific day. Lectures are very important. The textbook is good for background and structure. Lectures are important. I don't require attendance, but attendance is suggested because I talk about what I think is important. Obviously, history is a huge area which you can deal with almost anything. The first thing to deal with here on the whole 19th century, the first thing I want to talk about is the political party system. There's something called the new political history, which has been going on now for about 20 years. It's very interesting, and it's not all in itself, but it's very interesting stuff. What it deals with is something which other historians have never dealt with, namely, how do people vote? Why do people vote the way they do? Analyzing voting is known as voting behavior. I don't like the term. I just stuck with it. Why do people vote? And they're trying to correlate voting with other factors. Religious factors, economic factors, geographic. They're trying to figure out why they vote for different parties. In the course of doing that, they found out some interesting things. First of all, there are party systems. In other words, we think of political parties, Republican, Democratic, that's about it. It's not just that. There are systems which last for about 30 years or 50 years, and then it changes. Even if the labels of the parties are the same, the nature of the party changes fairly suddenly and sharply into a new system. So, for example, of course, the problem is you don't know what system you're in when the system changes for quite a while afterward, because you don't know whether this is a temporary glitch in the system or whether it's an important one. So you have to use hindsight. But there are, I think, maybe 5 party systems in the period we're dealing with here. The first party system. Usually in the United States, 2 parties. Probably because of the way it's structured, the electoral laws, the fact we have a big country, you have to have coalitions, whatever. We mostly a 2-party system, although there have been third parties from time to time, some importance. The first party system lasted from around 1796 to around, actually, 1815. There were the Federalists. We'll see what they represented, and the Democrat Republicans. Then what happened was, a very strange situation happened, not talked about much. From 1815 till about 1825, there was only one party in the United States. It's a pretty dangerous situation to have only one party. It was the Democrat Republican Party. The Federalists died out because they were against the War of 1812. They were considered traitors, etc., and they died out. Then a new party develops, the Democratic Party, and we have, from about 1828, second party system. This is like 1.5 in between, I guess. Second party system. From about 1828 to about 1854. There's precise dating is a little difficult, but it's around that period. Namely, the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, who essentially were successors of the Federalists, and the Democrats, essentially successors of the Democrat Republicans, with certain exceptions. We'll get into what they meant, what the label meant. 1854, the Whig Party dies out, the Republican Party comes in. We have a third party system, which lasts from 1854 to 1896. And that was the Republicans and Democrats. And even though the Republicans and Democrats are still around, this party system changed drastically in around 1896, 1900 to something very different. I think we have about, the fourth party system was say from 1900 to 1932. Some people say a little earlier, some people say later, around that. The fifth party system, 1932 to something, blank, 68, 80. Most people think we're now in a sixth party system, a very confused situation. So this is 32 to 50, let's say 60 something, 64 or whatever. So we're now something in the sixth party system. One way of looking at the differences here, the third party system was very closely fought. Most people had thought the Republicans were dominant. They weren't really dominant very much, only for the presidency, and even there were very close races. There was almost no period where the Republicans won both houses of Congress and the presidency. Usually one party or another had each house of Congress in this period. The fourth party system was a period of Republican dominance, except for Woodrow Wilson. The fifth party system was Democratic dominance. And right now it's sort of confused with a very high floating independent vote and Republicans winning most of the presidency and Democrats winning the House. So that's something like that. And one of the things that distinguishes all of this from the 20th century, all of the 19th century, the parties were fiercely ideological. Contrast to now, it's very difficult to figure out any ideology. The political parties were not just ways of getting into office and getting patronage. Of course they were that too, but they were also something else. They were organized around ideology and principle, and they're very fierce about it. There was nowadays, of course, they claim to have principles. When you get to the campaign, they're trying to attract the big floating independent votes. Everybody fuzzes up. So by November 1st or something, you can't tell the difference between one. They're all moving toward the center to find the floating vote. In those days, there was no floating vote. There was no independent vote, almost none. Everybody was either a Democrat or a Republican. Everybody hated the other party's guts. Okay? You voted Democrat, you voted Republican, you were staunch. And you expected your nominees to be just as staunch. If they started waffling, you just didn't go out and vote. No Democrat would vote Republican or vice versa. I mean, like voting for the enemy. What they do is they just wouldn't show up. If this guy's waffling, the hell with him. And so, in other words, the political candidates had to be even more militant during a campaign than they were the other times. They had to bring out the vote. Because most races were close in most states. And Democrats had to be fiercely Democratic and attack the Republicans bitterly and vice versa to get their people out. The result was a lot more excitement, a lot more ideological differences, and a lot more excitement in 19th century campaigns than there are now. Now you have to, it's very difficult to figure out any differences. So, and the ideological differences were severe and tremendous, and also the parties are extremely important. They're a way for the average person to have an influence on public affairs. In other words, in most cases, special interest groups take over, legislatures and Congress and a cabinet, whatever. Special interest groups looking for their own boodle will tend to take over. The average person hasn't got the time to get involved in this stuff. If you want to let's say you're the sugar refining industry. You have your lobbyists down there working 24 hours a day trying to get a subsidy or a tariff for sugar, right? They're trying to subsidize sugar refining. The average consumer, even though the consumer will be screwed by this, the average consumer doesn't know anything about it, hasn't got the time to invest in it, and so goes by default. So in those days, what political parties were, they essentially mobilized the average person for an ideology, either to stop the special interests or to confirm them, either one way or the other, depending on what the ideology was. So an ideological party meant there's some way to get around the special interest. There's a way for the average person to get involved in politics and to realize, to know if you're voting for Joe Turkey, he's not just Turkey, he's advancing your ideological interests, whatever they are. So it was an exciting time to be around, I think, in politics. Basically, this group here, and this had a similar ideology, economic ideology especially, all the way down to the 19th century. The Federalists, the Whigs, and the Republicans had basically a similar ideological structure. And the Democrats had a similar ideological structure throughout, with certain differences, obviously, but basically very, very hardcore, considering they're large parties trying to appeal to all sections, stuff like that. The Federalist, Whig, Republican group, their vision of the world, let's start with something else before we get to the economic part. One of the things that I was puzzled after a long time before I could find out the new political history told me the answer to this. I couldn't figure out this. In the 19th century, you have a huge amount of interest on economic questions, on banking, central banking, on tariffs. Everybody and his brother are out there writing illiterate pamphlets for and against the tariff, for and against gold and silver, for and against the central bank. I can't get my own students interested in it. And you're a captive audience. Why was everybody interested in economics? Nobody's interested in economics now. I mean, almost none. Unless they're unemployed or something, or big inflation. It's very difficult to get people interested. How come people are fascinated, but tremendously interested in economic question, and recondite obscure economic question? And the answer, I think, is given to us by the new political history, the so-called ethno-religious history. What they found was that the mass of the population they didn't start off being interested in banking and the tariff, things like that. They started off being interested in religious questions, local religious political issues. And they escalated from that to the economic question. Their consciousness was broadened, so to speak, to economic. Here's the way it worked. And here we have to get into religious history. All these things integrate. Fascinating thing about history, everything meshes together. What happens is that around 1830, around that, 1820s, 1830s, something crucial happened to American Protestantism. The American Protestant religion was transformed, even though they kept the same word, Baptist, Methodist, etc., totally transformed to something different. Before that, it was essentially Calvinist. You join the church, you obey the Calvinist creed, the law, obey God's law, and presumably, hopefully you'll be saved, although probably not. That was basically a very simplified version of Calvinist credo. Something happens to Protestantism in the 1820s and 30s with a revival movement. With a revival movement, which we're now pretty familiar with. Those days, nobody was familiar with. Something big, brand new. It was originally in Europe, and it comes to the United States, and people are rolling on the ground and getting born again and things like that, getting converted, and they get a new religion, really basically a new religion. A new religion basically is creeds don't matter. It doesn't matter what church you belong to. That's the beginning of the breaking up of American Protestants. Nobody cared. Now, nowadays, most Protestants don't care if they join a Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian. It doesn't make any difference. In the old days, of course, it made a big difference. Presbyterian meant you believe in the elect, general damnation, stuff like that. Now, from the 1830s on, it didn't make any difference what church you joined. Creeds were unimportant. Everybody was a Protestant together. That's why the YMCA and the YWCA were founded about that period. Because we're all Christians. What difference does it make what creed you're in? All Protestant Christians, I should say. And the basic view is this. Everybody, in order to be saved, joining a church or being baptized isn't enough. You have a new thing called the baptism of the Holy Spirit. You have to be born again. And you have to be born again through an emotional, mystical conversion experience. That's why you're rolling on the ground. It's often part of the conversion experience. So each person goes through these revival conversion experiences, and then and each person has a free will to be saved. This is a free will. Each person has a theological free will, can either be saved or not, and you have to try to achieve this mystical state or emotional state of being born again through the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And each individual is alone with God. There's no church. The church doesn't matter much here. So, and the next step was that each individual can easily not be saved because his free will is weak. So you have to have, if the church doesn't count much anymore, it doesn't matter what about creed or anything, it's all you and God. Therefore, the state has to step in. That happened very early. The government has to step in and stamp out temptation. Try to get you to be saved by stamping out temptation. There were lots of temptation. Stamp out sin, basically, or occasions for sin. These new Protestants, sin was everywhere. Almost everything was sinful. Any kind of enjoyment was sinful. Dancing was sinful. Gambling was sinful. All should be supposed to be outlawed because each individual is weak to temptation, and particularly and especially demon rum, liquor. The hysteria about liquor among so-called fundamentalists and new Protestants is enormous. Still is. It's kind of odd since Jesus himself drank wine. It's kind of odd for Protestants to drink grape juice at communion. The only way I can grasp this is because these people believe that in order to be saved, you have to have free will, and in order to be free will, your mind can't be clouded. See, if you drink liquor, your mind is clouded, and your theological free will is taken away from you. That's why these guys tended to be anti-slavery, not because they cared about slavery in the sense that most of us care about, liberty versus slavery. They cared about the slaves' theological free will to be saved was being interfered with. So, so what clouds men's minds? Demon rum, liquor, preventing, and therefore has to be outlawed, and especially and particularly the Antichrist, literally consider the Antichrist, the Catholic Church or the Pope in Rome. So, Catholic Church, the Pope was considered the Antichrist, and Catholicism is supposed to be stamped out as much as possible. So we have then the local and state level. These things are not hit the federal level, but on local and state politics, all of the new Protestants, there are two divisions now of these new Protestants. The Southern Protestants who tended to be salvationists, in other words, believe that everybody should try to be saved and that's it. They didn't have this fanatical zeal to stamp out sin. The Yankee Protestants, or the Northern Protestants, did, called evangelical pietism. Because part of the new creed in the North is that you can't be saved unless you try your best to maximize everybody else's salvation. This goes beyond missionary work. The usual idea of missionary work is to go and present the truth to everybody and hope they agree to it. This is very different. This idea is if you don't try your damnedest to stamp out sin and save everybody else, you yourself won't be saved. You have a tremendous zeal to stamp out sin. So you have this, how should we put it, crusading spirit. The way they put it is, we have to achieve the kingdom of God on earth through these methods. We have to stamp out sin. We have to make America holy and make the world holy. This is a messianic creed, this new Protestantism. Excuse me. So this was the new Protestantism. This was it focused on several things. If they couldn't kick out the Catholics, since we had a free country, we try to keep out immigrants. If you can't keep out Catholic immigrants, they tried to do that. If they can't keep out Catholic immigrants, then Christianize, what they call Christianize the Catholics. We have to get the kids. They consider Catholics being heathen and followers of Antichrist. Therefore, if there aren't any Catholics, unfortunately, we have to stamp them out by getting the kids and putting them into a Protestantized public school system. The public school system in the 19th century was not secular, it was Protestant. They read the Protestant Bible. In most jurisdictions, you had to be a member of the Protestant church in order to be a public school teacher. The whole idea is to get the Catholic kids and convert them, save them, because otherwise you yourself won't be saved. Stamp out liquor, outlaw liquor. This is going on since 1830. And stamp out Sunday enjoyment, Sabbath laws. Even in my day, when my wife was growing up in the South, you couldn't play baseball on Sunday. It was illegal. So up until World War II, this is still going on in the United States. Sabbath laws. Sabbath should be kept holy. Should be able to do nothing on Sunday except go to church. Period. Anything else is sinful and monstrous. Drinking on Sunday is the worst possible sin. It combines two of the great sins. Right? Drinking itself is sinful. Doing anything, going to church on Sunday is sinful. Drinking on Sunday is like the old double sin. Okay? It drove the pietists wild. We call these pietists. Okay. Now, most of the people who took to this sort of fanatical zeal were the so-called Yankees, who already, even before this happened, what some historians would call cultural imperialists. They try to shape everybody up. The sort of people who want to shape everybody up by force. So the Yankees took to this like a duck takes to water. Hey, this is great. Now, what are Yankees? Yankees don't mean just Northerners. When the Southerners used to say, damn Yankees, they're much more specific than that. They meant Yankee ethnic group or cultural group, essentially who started out, they were of course English descent. They started out in rural New England, not so much Boston, but rural Massachusetts, rural Connecticut, and then emigrated. They were big migrants. They emigrated, they populated most of the northeast. In other words, everybody in upstate New York, almost without exception, especially western New York, Buffalo, that whole area, Genesee Valley, all that stuff is sort of deserted area, that whole area there. Plus northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, that whole area was Yankee. In other words, when you say Yankee, you mean everything from rural, outside of Boston, not so much the cities, but outside of Boston, west to around Chicago and so forth. Okay, that's Yankee. And so Yankees took to this, I say, like a duck takes to water. New England stock. The same thing is going on. There's fights are going on in California. It turns out they're all Yankees. All the pro-public school people are Yankees. They were born in New England and emigrated. So the idea, to say, of the public school was to shape up the Catholics, get the kids, and convert them. So this is one group. The party, there's almost a one-to-one correlation here from the studies that have been done. The political party these people supported, almost to a man, were first the Federalists, after 1830, the Whigs and then the Republicans. In other words, the Whig Party and then the Republican Party were essentially the WASP pietist party. With certainly, obviously a few exceptions here and there, but basically with mass voting behavior, if you were a pietist, a Yankee pietist, you were a Republican. Conversely, what happens then is originally the Democrat Republicans were not the Yankees. The Yankees were the Federalists. Democrat Republicans were the Dutch types, the Scotch Irish, whatever. Later on, what happens is the other big religious group now coming into the United States were Roman Catholics and High Lutherans. The Lutherans are split. There's Low Lutherans, Pietist Lutherans, Scandinavian Lutherans. They're very, very much like Yankee Pietists. And German Lutherans are mostly High Church. The High Church Lutherans and Roman Catholics come to the United States with a very different creed. They're no holy rollers there. Except, of course, nowadays this is all shot. Catholic Church is not what it used to be. I'm talking now, of course, before 1930s, before 1950s. At any rate, Catholic Church and High Lutheran Church, basically the idea is you achieve salvation through entering the church, through baptism and keeping the sacraments. The church takes care of salvation. You don't need the state to stamp out sin. Okay? So in other words, you have a much more libertarian basis right away. Second of all, sin is not everything enjoyable. Like the Catholic position and the High Lutheran position always has been. Obviously, if you're drunk a lot, this is sinful. On the other hand, if you drink in moderation, there's nothing wrong with it. Pleasurable, so what? Much more, as far as I'm concerned, much more rational view. Okay, so the Catholics and the High Church Lutherans come to the United States and they don't worry about sin because they think, well, the church takes care of that. All of a sudden, they're beset by what they consider crazies, rushing in to destroy bars, destroy liquor, trying to force their kids into a public school system. They want to have parochial schools so they can transmit their religious values to their kids. Who are these fanatics? Who are these crazies, wasp crazies coming in and chopping up the bar? Well, and particularly the Germans are a very lovable group, both German Catholics and German Lutherans. In German culture, the whole family goes to church, and then they repair to a beer garden, charming beer garden. They play, a brass band plays, having a lot of quiet fun. All of a sudden, the wasp crazies, the carrying nation types come in with hatchets and chop up, destroy the beer. Sin. Okay, you have a total religious culture clash. So what we had for 100 years, for 90 years, on the local and state level, constantly, because they were pests. The wasps were pests. Because they believed that in order for them to be saved, they have to try to save everybody else. So they were constantly trying to outlaw liquor, constantly trying to outlaw parochial schools, and constantly trying to outlaw Sunday activity. Also outlaw teaching the German language, a special dig, say. Outlaw German schools altogether. So the Roman Catholics and the High Lutherans, 1-to-1, almost man for man, voted Democratic. So what you had then is that the Whigs and the Republicans were the Pietist parties, the Democratic Party, the Catholics, we call them the liturgical groups. These are the Pietists. And the other groups are called the liturgicals. We emphasize liturgy. Liturgicals almost all voted Democratic. Some very interesting studies in the different Lutheran synods. The Lutherans are split in different, very high church Lutherans and moderately, and then very low church, very Pietist. And the voting record is such that the stuff has been done on Midwestern voting. It turns out the highest church, the highest synod, which is the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod, almost all voted like 90% Democratic, 95% Democratic. The Scandinavian Synods, which are all very low church, voted like 10% Democratic, 90% Republican. So you have, in other words, the Pietist groups voting almost completely Republican, the Catholics and Lutherans voting almost completely Democratic. The Democrats were known, except for the slavery question, which is obviously a separate situation. The Democrats were known as the party of personal liberty. Okay. And the Republicans were known as the party of great moral ideas. Great moral ideas like stamping out liquor, stamping out sin, outlawing sin, things like that. Okay, party of great moral ideas versus the party of personal liberty. So this is going on the state and local level. This is what people, they're interested in their gut. They're more interested in this than in economic questions. Okay, they were interested in having their church or having their school or outlawing somebody else's school and having their liquor outlawed. This is gut stuff. Fierce fighting going on for 100 years. So how did the economic picture come in? The economic picture came in this way. Personal liberty. Yeah. Economically, I started to say this, I'll get back to this now. Economically, the Federalists, the Whigs and Republicans were statist. In other words, they believe in big government. We'll go into different aspects of this. next hour. And the Democrats were libertarian. Okay, they believe in minimal government, minimal free trade, laissez-faire, hard money, no government intervention, etc. So the interesting thing is, how did the Democratic leadership, who were interested in economic questions, when they went to their local people, how did they convert local people to interest in economics, and same way with the Republicans or Whigs? They did it by taking the religious issues and widening the consciousness of their constituents to the economic. In other words, the Republicans or the Whigs would go to their people and say, look, just as we need big government on the local level to stamp out sin, right? Right. We need paternalism, as they call it, on the local level, okay? Just as we need big government on the local level to stamp out sin, so we need big government on the federal level to increase everybody's purchasing power, to keep out cheap foreign goods, protect the tariff, increase purchasing power through inflation, through paper money, cheap credit. Through big public works, we need a whole big government structure. So in other words, they say, and the Republicans say, yes, of course. So in other words, they show the application of the religious values of the public to economic questions. The Democratic leadership did the same thing for their part. They said, look, you see these WASP SOBs are trying to eliminate our liquor and trying to eliminate our churches, our schools, etc. Yes. These same guys want to have big government on the federal level to keep out cheap goods, to try to have monopoly privileges to their people, the different corporations or whatever, and they're trying to have inflation, which will rob the value of your purchasing power, and trying to have government intervention, trying to have big high taxes and so forth. The same way they're trying to have big government on the local level. So they widen the consciousness of their people. They're all integrated. So libertarianism on the local level meant libertarianism in economics, so laissez-faire in economics. The same way, statism on the local level was translated into Republicans into statism on the economic federal level. So that's what you had in the 19th century. You had two consistent parties, consistent ideologies, both on local religious, social, what we call now social issues, such as liquor and school systems and things like that, and versus a consistent libertarian position. And so minimal government on local social and religious questions was translated to minimal government on economic questions, and vice versa for maximal government, so to speak, on social and religious questions to the economic questions. So that's why the people got interested. Now that solved my long-term question on this thing, how they got interested in money and banking and all that. Okay, so that was the two parties, those were the two ideologies, that was the two ethno-religious bases. In the Civil War, we had almost a one-party Congress. In other words, since the South was almost all Democratic, or getting almost all Democratic, and the South, they were not Catholic, but they were exceptional. The Southerners, they were not fanatics, okay, so they were part of the Democratic coalition. When they left, when they seceded from the Union, it meant we had almost a one-party Congress, I mean, a total Republican Congress. At that point, the Republican Party used the opportunity, heaven-sent opportunity, so to speak, to put through their entire economic program, which they couldn't put through before. One of the interesting things that happens here is that twice in the 19th century, once in around the 1830s, 1840s, and the next time around 1880s, 90s, the Democratic Party was becoming slowly but surely the majority party. We'll see in the 1890s. And one reason is because maybe libertarianism was more attractive to the public. Second reason is that the demographics was such that Catholics were getting stronger relative to Protestants. There were more Catholic immigrants than there were Protestant immigrants, and the Catholics had a higher birth rate, as you probably all know. So the result of all this, of higher immigration and higher birth rate, is the Catholic Lutheran, High Church Lutheran, were gradually becoming majority. The first time this happened in the 1840s. We're getting to have a solid Democratic majority, and then what happened is, of course, the split over slavery, and the whole thing goes up the chute. Democratic Party split wide open on the slavery question, and then we have the Civil Wars. That killed that. The next time we'll see later on, it happened in the early and middle 1890s, the Democratic Party is slowly surely becoming a majority, and we'll see what happened with that. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break or so, and come back for the second hour. The Republicans did, during the Civil War started, was to put through, since the Democrats had been more or less the majority, as a matter of fact, Democrats had won every presidential election aside from 1840 for about 30 years. With the Civil War, with a one-party Congress, the Republicans used the opportunity to push through their entire national statist economic program. First of all, of course, big government, very high spending and all that. An income tax for the first time in American history. A high protective tariff, which is one of the big Republican planks. Whig and Republican, yeah. Civil War. Precisely it. Income tax and protective tariff. To pay for the war effort and to build up a big machine. Also to pay for the war effort, and also as part of the economic program, irredeemable paper money. In other words, before that we had a gold standard, gold and silver, really gold standard, hard money policy, to allow inflationary cheap money, paper money. The greenbacks were issued, also by the South. And the South also did the same thing, but the North did it with ideological fervor. So-called greenbacks, meaning the green paper money we've got right now, right? The gold coins, of course, were gold color. Greenbacks are green. Okay. Also, in addition, for allegedly financing the war effort, and also for its own sake, a high public debt, heavy deficit finance. The first part of the war was financed by greenbacks, but then the greenbacks began to depreciate. In other words, we got to the point after about 2-3 years of the war that one paper dollar was worth about 50 cents in gold coins. The dollar began to depreciate because it was inflationary. So in other words, if you went to buy a loaf of bread, if it was $1 in terms of gold coins, it was $2 in terms of paper. So since the greenbacks were getting to the point of getting worthless, they had to shift to a public debt. Also, a national banking system, which we'll go into more detail a little bit later, which essentially outlawed state banknotes. Part of the Republican creed was a centralization, put everything in the hands of the central government as much as possible. With the Democrats, the idea is to have as little as possible in the hands of the federal government, and then devolve on the states and have pretty limited state government also. Have most of the stuff done by the public, by the people themselves. If you have anything done by government, it should be at a state and local level, with almost nothing in the federal government. With the Republicans, it's just the opposite. So we have national banking system, which means outlawing state banks and pyramiding on top of a few Wall Street banks. We'll see that, and we'll get to that later. I'm not going to spend too much time on banking, it's pretty technical. But it's important. And huge subsidies to railroads, which we'll get into next after we talk about the Civil War. Huge land grant subsidies to railroads. Giving away the public domain of railroads, a few privileged railroads. High excise taxes for the first time. There was some in the War of 1812, but mostly high excise taxes on two things in particular, which continued on forever since then. Namely, notice the pietist note now, liquor and tobacco. Two enjoyable occupations. Don't forget, nobody knew about lung cancer in those days. They were against tobacco because it was enjoyable, therefore sinful. As H.L. Mencken, my favorite writer, once wrote, defining Puritanism, he said, a Puritan is a person with the haunting fear that somebody somewhere might be happy. Okay, so these high excise taxes still exist. You can't imagine how cheap liquor was before the Civil War. It was incredible. A gallon of top scotch was like 80 cents or something like that. And so it wasn't just the prices. Of course, the price of the dollar is worth more than it is now, but most of it is due to the goddamn taxes. Huge excise taxes on liquor, which continue on. This continues permanent part of the American heritage. So if they couldn't outlaw liquor, they could at least slap a high tax on it. That's the point. And for the first time really in American history, and certainly on the national level, conscription, the draft. And cracking down on dissenters, the suspension of habeas corpus, one of the basic parts of Anglo-Saxon law and also libertarian law. Nobody can be jailed without being charged with something, with some crime, right? And then be tried for it. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus for the entire war, just locked people up if they were against the war effort. If they were in favor of peace with the South, negotiated peace with the South, he locked them up. So there was an outlawing of dissent, which the Supreme Court said later on was unconstitutional. Not that it did any good. It was after the war was over. They said, in retrospect, you had no right to do it. Cracking down on all newspaper editors or writers who are against in favor of peace with the South. Okay, I think that's more or less it. That's more or less the entire bowl of wax. They put in, not because they were favorable, but because it's to appease the Western farmer types, the homestead law, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But this is the basic statist economic program. It's all put through the high tariff, the high excise taxes, inflationary cheap money, public debt, nationalizing the banking system, big, huge subsidies to railroads. All these things, the Democrats, being laissez-faire party, are against subsidies, in favor of no government intervention, in favor of free market, free trade, the very low budget, very low taxes, no subsidies, no special privileges, etc., etc. So this is more or less the situation before the Civil War, with some exceptions, obviously. Just looking at it broadly. This is the Republican program. Now, most of it continued on, since the Republicans were fairly dominant until about the 1870s because of the Civil War. For about 10 or 15, 20 years after the Civil War, Republicans maintained their dominance by what was called waving the bloody shirt. This was done by some Republican campaigner. He waved a bloody shirt, and what did he say? That besides the Democrats were a party of treason, they're the party of the rebellion and treason. They waved the shirt of some soldier who died in the Northern cause. This is the shirt of Hiram Jones, who died from local Illinois or somewhere. If you vote Democrat, you betray the Civil War and stuff like that. So this worked for about 20 years. By the 1870s, it didn't work much anymore. But that was there's a famous phrase, by the way, in 1884 campaign, when Cleveland won. Cleveland was the first Democrat to win after the Civil War as president. And when he won, it was a very close campaign. And the thing that probably switched it was about a week before the election, a Republican WASP minister, actually being Republican, in New York, Reverend Burchard, attacked the Democratic Party. He said the Democratic Party is the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Now notice these three things. This was essentially the pietist program, Republican program, summed up in one phrase. The Democratic Party is the party of rum, in other words, evil demon rum. Liquor clouds men's minds so they can't get salvation. Romanism, in other words, the Roman Catholic Church. And rebellion, the southern side of the Civil War. This so angered anybody who was sort of marginal type that it swung the election of Cleveland. So angered any neutrals or any moderates. This is monstrous, and there was enough to turn enough votes against them to shift the election of Cleveland. Now, how much this lasted? The national banking, we never got out of the national banking system. We never achieved free banking, and as we had before the Civil War. Democrats were never able to get rid of this. So this was a permanent heritage until we got the Federal Reserve System in 1913. I'll get into that later. But essentially, they say it outlawed state banknotes and centralized the banking system on a few Wall Street banks, basing their issues on reserves on credit on government bonds. We'll get into that later. We never got Jefferson and Jackson. Jackson was the only president, I think, but Jefferson did too, to pay off the federal debt. Paid off the public debt. Jackson paid it off in the 1830s. The Republicans went into so much debt by the Civil War that it became impossible. Of course, what's happening now. That's protective tariff we never got really rid of. Republicans remained in power until the Wilson administration. Cleveland Wilson, we never really got back down We reduced it to some extent. It took many decades to get rid of that. The income tax we only got rid of because it was unconstitutional, declared unconstitutional. Greenbacks we only got rid of by 1879. We finally got back to the gold standard. It was a tough, titanic struggle to do that. We never got rid of the high excise taxes on liquor and tobacco. So these were permanent legacies of the Civil War. The huge land grants stopped in 1873. It started in 1862. Lasted to 1873. By that time, most of the land was given away. Well, most of the transcontinental railroads were built. Also, they began to go bankrupt. So there was an orgy of 10 years of huge subsidies to the railroads. Conscription, of course, was over after the war, but set a precedent for World War I and II. And outlawing dissent survived during World War I and II. Of course, it stops after the Civil War is over. So much of this continues on as part of the income. Much of it continues on as part of the legacy to try to battle back from the tremendous increase of state power and statism and government intervention that took place during the Civil War period. What's happening, as a matter of fact, in American history, what we usually have, of course, you can't really do this precisely, but if you could chart government intervention, the degree of government intervention in the economy and the society, starting with 1780s, it starts very low. Pegs along more or less very low. And then we got a war. We got the War of 1812. We got an increase. And it took about 20 years to wash out the intervention of the War of 1812. Excise taxes, conscription, banking mess up, anyway, and public debt. By the 1840s, we get rid of that. And we get to the Civil War. We got a huge increase. We never really get rid of it. It sort of sloughs off a bit. And the 1900 increase, and then World War I, you have another big increase, and World War II, another big one. That's about it. Most of the increase, except for the 1900 period, which is the progressive era, most of the big increases in government intervention come in wartime. And usually a big legacy continues after the war is over. One of the big, as I said, we'll get into that in more detail later. One of the big interventions, chapter 13, by the way, Hughes deals with, was the Civil War, did the Civil War promote industrialization? You read, I'll get to that on Thursday. So one of the big programs of the government and Lincoln and Grant administration was huge subsidies to railroads. The subsidies began really a little bit, to some extent, in the 1850s. Railroads began in the 1850s. You want to take this gives you an idea of transport. First of all, I have to realize the significance of railroads in general. I have to realize something, key thing. Before, say, the 1830s or 1840s, when railroads were first invented, before that, from the beginning of time until 1840, means from the year 5000 BC or whatever, there was no land transportation, ever. You have to realize that. Nobody moved on land. Okay? You couldn't move on land. The movement was all on water, ocean, and rivers, and that's it. Okay? And you could only live near an ocean or near a river. And so all the trade was going on ocean and river. There's no such thing as overland transportation. No roads, yeah. Yeah, it was covered by, but I mean, basically I'm talking about passengers can go take a couple of months. I'm talking about real trade, goods and service, goods transported. You couldn't have any real transport. Okay. Sure, you could go out in the woods, whatever. But the point is, in any kind of a large scale, you had dirt roads. There's no automobiles, no trucks, and no railroads. So you got dirt roads with carts and wagons and so forth. You can make it to the nearest river. You're in good shape. Okay. So the advent of the railroads was a fantastic thing. It was a tremendous thing for the world because it meant cheap land transportation for the first time. Cheap, efficient land transportation. Of course, so everybody wanted to get a hold. Before that, there were canals. I mean, if you couldn't have a river, you'd dig a canal from one river to the other. And so in England in the 18th century, for example, you had a big network of canals. You can move from one place to the other inside the country. To give you an idea of the railroad, therefore the first big business, the first large-scale capital was railroads. Okay, when there was no manufacturing, was never much of anything. It was not a big business until the 1890s. The first corporation were banks. That doesn't really count. Something different. Government is supposed to be a corporation. Doesn't count. First real corporations were railroad corporations. First amassing of large-scale capital. Okay. So that's where you start with railroads as the first big business. And just to give you a little statistic here of mileage, total mileage in the United States. Okay. canals and railroads. Total mileage all summed up. In 1840, there were 3.3 thousand miles of canals, and there were 3.3 thousand miles of railroads. In other words, canals were just as important as railroads in 1840. Then it changes. In 1840, there's a big change. By 1850, there were 3.7 thousand miles of canals, 8.9 thousand miles of railroads. By 1860, there were 30.6 thousand miles of railroads. There was a big railroad boom in the 50s. We'll see later on, by the way, that industry in general took off in the 50s. Railroads began to take off in the 1850s. Canals began to die out. I mean, they stopped, if anything, it declines after that. Railroads are basically cheaper, except, of course, when they're right there in the Erie Canal or something. But basically, the railroad is a fantastic reducer, tremendous reducer of transportation cost. So at the beginning, you have railroads, and from one teeny railroad to another, like one, Perth Amboy to New York. It's a big railroad, 30 miles or something. And as time goes on, as more and more, they learn more, there's more capital investment, they learn more technology, etc. The railroads began to merge into a long line. So by the 1850s, certainly by the Civil War, the railroad network east of the Mississippi was more or less built. And it was lots of mileage, and mostly merged into one long line. So you start off with, say, New York, Philadelphia would have originally 8 railroads from New York, like one New York to Perth Amboy, and Perth Amboy. And then, of course, they'd integrate and they'd merge into one, much more efficient, have one line from New York to Philadelphia. Things like that. By the way, I forget now when this happened. I'll get to it a little later. But one interesting thing is, I bet you all of you think, it happened around the 1879 or 1880s or something. I bet you most of you think that where does the Eastern Standard Daylight Saving, where does Eastern Standard, Central Standard Time come from? You probably think it was imposed by the government at one point, right? That the government in its wisdom said, okay, we have Eastern Standard Time, we have Western, Central, Pacific, Mountain, and Pacific. It was not done by the government. Originally, there were about 80 different time zones. Every 10 miles had a different time zone. Because nobody travels, nobody really gave a damn. If you couldn't travel, if it took you 2 weeks to get from here to Boston, it doesn't matter. You can adjust your watch. But so there are lots of time. Every 5 miles, every 10 miles, you have a different time zone, like another 10 minutes. You see, if you want to do it, I guess technically, there's no such thing as a time zone. You don't have 1 hour when you get to Chicago. When you get to Perth Amboy, you adjust it by 5 minutes. So it means nobody ever knows what the hell time it is. And nobody cares if you never travel. Everybody in Perth Amboy, it's 4:30, and Perth Amboy might be 4:25. Nobody really cares. But the railroads, when they started Transcontinental Railroad, they started going from one, they couldn't mess around with it. They have to have a timetable, okay? They have to have a schedule. They couldn't have 80 time zones. So the railroads got together in a convention, and they agreed on time zones, just arbitrarily. They said, okay, we'll have an Eastern Standard Time, we'll have a Western, Central and Mountain and Pacific. It was the railroads that did it. The government had nothing to do with it. The government didn't care. The railroads had an economic incentive to do something about it. They were losing money all the time by worrying about when the thing come, what timetable. It was impossible. It was total chaos. It was the railroads that brought order out of chaos on that. By the way, the daylight saving time, which I presume the railroads are not responsible, was a later invention of government. It's still a little peculiar because some of the, for example, Arizona has never gone on daylight saving time, so that Arizona, you have to remember that they're still on standard time, things like that. At any rate, it was much more chaotic in the old days, whenever it was, 1880s, when the railroads had the agreement. Similarly, the railroads began to get together and say, look, we have to have a standard gauge. The car's going to go from one track to the other, and every gauge is different size. You ain't going to make it. So the railroads got together and decided what the gauge should be. And again, in the interest of having an efficient, profitable and efficient railroad system. Okay, one of the railroad subsidies began really in the mid-50s or so with, first of all, every one-horse town wants to have its railroad. Remember, there's no roads. So every one-horse town, we can't really prosper unless we have a railroad. So they begin to have subsidies to get the railroad to come through your town. Beginning of overbuilding. It's one thing to have. Don't forget, in those days there were lots of railroads. Every one-horse town had about 5 railroads going through it. And so, as a result, there was overbuilding of railroads because there's a lot of subsidies on the local level, on the state level, and finally on the federal level. So what you have by about 1870s or so, you begin to have bankruptcies and collapses of the railroads. At any rate, the biggest railroad before the Civil War was the Illinois Central, which I think went from Chicago to New Orleans, I believe. It was heavily subsidized and therefore politicized. In other words, you had the railroad was sort of a political railroad. Since they wanted subsidies, most of the eastern railroads didn't have subsidies. They made it without it, a free market. They wanted subsidies and began to buy politicians. And so you begin to have a situation where Senator so-and-so was an Illinois Central man. Was known as an Illinois Central person. This is what I meant before at the beginning of the 2 hours here. I was talking about you have to know who these guys are before they become senators or whatever. Stephen Douglas, for example, of the Democratic Party, was an Illinois Central person. He was hip deep in Illinois Central. He was a heavy stockholder. He also owned a lot of real estate at the terminal in Chicago, where he was a senator from Illinois, Democratic senator, where the Illinois Central was having its terminal. So he would sell the real estate to the Illinois Central, very heavily personally involved. Then he go out in the Senate and lobby. So that was Douglas. I'm not going to go too much into him since he lost out for the presidency. At any rate, another person who did not lose out, was also an Illinois Central person basically, was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is known in the history books as a real splitter. The image of him is, in addition to being like Raymond Massey and speaking like Raymond Massey, I don't know if he spoke like Raymond Massey. He certainly looked like him. Anyway, you see the picture of him splitting. He never split rails. A lot of nonsense. It's like Reagan riding a horse on the ranch, guys. That sort of thing. He never split rails. He was a railroad attorney, a pretty wealthy railroad attorney. Matter of fact, he was hired as a lobbyist by Illinois Central, for example, to get them their charter in 1850. So he was a top lawyer, railroad lawyer, and was also mostly an Illinois Central lawyer. His wife's sister's father-in-law was a big shot president of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which is another big railroad. He was definitely a railroad person. Western railroads. He was a dark horse candidate for Republican nomination in 1860. Seward was supposed to get it. Seward was connected with Wall Street law practice. And New York State. So nobody heard much about Lincoln. His campaign manager, a brilliant campaign manager, essentially won him the nomination, was Norman Judd, who was a Chicago lawyer, chairman of the Illinois Republican Party, and a railroad official, particularly a big shot on the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, the famous Rock Island line, which went from Chicago to Omaha. It's a top, very important terminus. Because it's from Omaha to the famous Union Pacific would start moving pretty soon to the transcontinental, to the west. The other guy I hope got on the nomination was Judge David Davis, an old friend of Lincoln, who, before he became a judge, or was he before he became a judge? Judges are not always just sitting on the bench. They're often pretty active politically. He was a big shot of Illinois Central. He was a top person in Illinois Central. He also sold a lot of acreage in Illinois Central, something like Stephen Douglas did. So what we have then is is Lincoln himself, heavily involved in Illinois Central, and also his two big campaign managers at the Republican convention. He was definitely a Western Railroad person. The other interesting figure in the cabinet, I'm not going to go through the whole cabinet, the other interesting figure is the Secretary of Treasury. This involves with banking and deficits and so forth. The guy who was made Secretary of the Treasury, Lincoln administration, Salmon P. Chase, a former Democrat from Cincinnati. Now, for some reason, Chase was always heavily they always needed money. I guess lots of us need money. He needed a lot of money, even though his wife's father was one of the wealthiest landowners in Cincinnati, owned half of Cincinnati. But he always needed money. So Chase was the two guys who got him into office, who lobbied to get him to be Secretary of Treasury, because he was an ex-Democrat, so he wasn't really in big favor, with the Cook brothers. J. Cook, the first famous banker. His brother Henry Cook was a big shot newspaper editor, like Cincinnati, whatever. So Henry Cook was, J. Cook was a banker in Philadelphia, went to Philadelphia, became a banker, not too, sort of a moderate-sized banker, not too great shape. As soon as Lincoln, they poured a lot of money into Chase's campaign. It's estimated over the years, by 1864, in other words, by the end of the Lincoln administration, J. Cook personally invested $100,000 in Chase's campaigns. This is Chase's political life. It was boodles, either subsidies, bribery, or campaign. Now, $100,000 in the 1860s is enormous. It's over $1 million now, more than $1 million now, I think. Maybe more than maybe $5 million or something like that. Enormous amount of money poured in to Chase's campaign by Cook. So you have a very close connection between Chase and Cook. So Cook pours a lot of money into Chase's political stuff. He lobbies to get Chase named as Secretary of Treasury. And then what happens? The quid pro quo. After the greenbacks begin to fade out because they're depreciating, they're inflated, they put out a gimmick here, the National Banking Act. The gimmick is this. First of all, Cook gets, from the Treasury Department, the monopoly on the underwriting of all government bonds. Huge amount of government bonds are now pouring out to pay for the war effort. Cook gets the monopoly. In other words, Cook was the first investment banker. He sets up the house of J. Cook, Cook and Company in Philadelphia, J. Cook and Company, and he gets a contract from the Treasury that Cook has a monopoly on all floating and government bonds for the entire war. As a matter of fact, it happened continuing on from then on until the 1870s. Except for 1 or 2 years, Cook had a monopoly on all government bond issue, which is incredible. So this means that Cook gets a rake off on every government bond that's sold. That's the Chase-Cook connection. It's the way politics works. Cook pours $100,000 into Chase's political career. Chase becomes Secretary of Treasury and grants Cook monopoly on all government bonds. Now, Cook is the first con man in finance. By con man, I mean this. He takes... You realize this is the days before the science of public relations had been invented. There were no PR men, no professional PR men. No Madison Avenue. Cook was the first guy who said, I got all these bonds. How am I going to sell them? Who's going to buy this stuff? He hires propagandists. He hires agents to comb the country saying, buy America and that sort of stuff. All this stuff, all these phony campaigns of government bond salesmen begin with Cook. Hiring pamphleteers to talk about the glories of government bonds, how government bonds are wonderful. I'm telling you, you can be wiped out by inflation, things like that. It all starts with Cook. So in addition, that's the number one. And then Cook decides the way to fix up the banking system is we outlaw state banknotes, and we create a national banking system, which was done in 1863, I think, 64, and say that only national banks can issue banknotes. In other words, other banks can still have deposits. You go to a checking account, you have a checking account, you can still do that, but actual notes like paper money, in the old days every bank used to issue paper money, say, that was payable in gold. You go to the Bank of Great Neck, you get $10 Bank of Great Neck, which they would have to pay gold on if you demanded it, and gold coins or treasury notes, usually gold coin. And that's it. This is a free banking system, a free competitive banking system, which was pretty hard money-ish because no bank could expand very much, couldn't inflate very much, because then they'd be called upon them for redemption. People from outside of Great Neck would start calling upon a redemption. They wouldn't have the money, they go bankrupt. So it was a very tightly uninflated system. It was a very hard money system, which is, of course, what the Democrats were in favor of. Well, now we have the Republicans come in. They've mainly created a system where state banknotes are outlawed. Only a new thing called national banks, which didn't exist before. There were no national banks. Every bank was chartered by the state government, some state government. Now we have new things called national banks, chartered by the federal government, which had to be very large. In other words, a few large banks, mostly on Wall Street, a few New York, Philadelphia banks, half a dozen banks. They become the basis of the whole banking system. The banks now pyramid on top. Before that, we had individual banks. You have gold, issue maybe 3 times as many banknotes. Now they can't do that because only national banks can issue banknotes. The national banks, the state banks have to have accounts with the national bank to try to get banknotes. So you have to pyramid on top of the national banks, a few Wall Street banks, a few Philadelphia banks. These national banks pyramid on top of what? They pyramid on top of government bonds. In other words, They can create credit. They can expand credit and money. And of course, how many government bonds they buy. If they buy $1,000 in government bonds, they can, say, have $5,000 in bank credit, which the state banks then pyramid on top of. So in other words, the more government bonds they buy, the more they can pyramid inflationary credit on top of it. Okay, so the national banks who do they get the bonds from? They get it from only one person, Jay Cook. He's got a monopoly. So Cook lobbies for it, and then they have to go to Cook to get their money so they can inflate on top of it, expand credit on top of it. That was a racket. It was a magnificent racket. Cook himself created a couple of national banks, which he owned too. So we then have Cook emerging from the war as a multimillionaire, as the top investment banker, and mostly financial. He didn't have much money before the war started. He was a sort of moderate banker. He begins to get a lot from the Civil War. He was also a Republican. He was a Republican banker and tied in with the Republican Party and Republican administration. So we have then Henry Cook as editor of the top Ohio Republican paper. We have Jay Cook as underwriter, monopoly underwriter, and the only guy from the national banks can go to get their government bonds from. So anyway, that was the Chase. That was the Chase connection. That was the way the Treasury worked during the Civil War. Okay, just to begin the Civil War question, it used to be thought until about 20 or 30 years ago, the textbooks have the view, which of course Hughes does not have, since he's up to date. They had the view that the Civil War launched industrialization in the United States. The railroads, the manufacturing, all these things start with the Civil War, because the war gave a stimulus to industry. And this is an old, and therefore, there's all the textbooks. This was, finally began to do some research, and they found out it's just the opposite. War retarded industrialization, which makes more sense. After all, the war was siphoning off a lot of effort, the war effort, into armaments and stuff like that, which didn't have time for any kind of fundamental improvement. So, as a matter of fact, the takeoff stage, as they used to call it, and industrialization really begins in the United States with 1850. Just as railroads began in the 1850s, so did industrialization. Not as big as railroads, but everything really begins in the 1850s. Iron manufacturing increases by 2/3 in that decade. Textile manufacturing goes up by 2/3. Interchangeable parts begin to come in. The whole concept of interchangeable parts really starts later, but it begins to come in then. See, before that, and this, by the way, goes on from then, there's some new work being done claiming it's handicraft lasts for a long time. In the old days, what you do is you have, even when you have machines, you have craftsmen or mechanics that go out there and they fit the machine. And so there's a lot of handwork going on in each machine. There's a lot of expensive, obviously, handwork. With interchangeable parts, machine-made interchangeable parts means they can all be replaced easily. They fit together. You don't need hand fitting. It begins to come in the 1850s. It really only reaches a peak with Henry Ford. 1920s. Really, mass production really only began, 1910s. Really only begins with Henry Ford. But it begins to come in armories and stuff like that, and also in some manufacturing in the 1850s. Arms factories, clocks, begins with things like that. But armament, one of the reasons why armament comes in, because you want to be able to replace the arm. If there's some piece of the rifle that's broken, you want to be able to replace it, obviously, and fit it in. So it's a big advantage to do that. No new contribution begins, no new big contribution is in the Civil War, starts with the Civil War. As a matter of fact, the war delayed technological development. For example, the Bessemer steel process, which was a big thing in England by the 1850s, was a big advance. Only really is adopted here after the Civil War, because you haven't got time. You have to grind out arms. There's no time to retool and invest in the Bessemer steel process. So that only after 1865 does that come in. As a matter of fact, steel in general really just comes in. And before that, it was mostly just plain iron. And the Bessemer steel, you have shift to a steel process. And all the things like mechanization, beginnings of corporation, all these things, cotton textile manufacturing begins to take off in the 1850s. So all these things, you'll see more of that in Hughes. And as a matter of fact, there tends to be a sort of breakdown in production because they're working the equipment too hard during the Civil War and begins to break down. The productivity begins to fall, and they can only replace it after the war is over. Okay, that's it. Time is up. So the Hughes book. Okay, so I'm going to give you some statistics to show. I'm not going to give you too much statistics, I hope, of course, but to show that the Civil War had a retarding effect on industrialization instead of a stimulating effect. There are various ways to do this. There's a statistic called value added by manufacturing. It's a way of trying to find out in dollar form how much national income is added by manufacturing. What the hell's going on? Try to keep them quiet out there, otherwise we won't be able to have to shut the door, you won't have any air. Excuse me. Quiet. A large class with no teacher is always an explosive combination. Okay. From 1849 to 59, in other words, the decade of the 50s, this went up by 76%. Now there's no precise percentages here. And of course, you have to realize also that as the economy grows, the percentages will probably decline. But at any rate, but this is enough of a factor to be important. 1859 to 69, plus 25%, a big slowing down. And then 1869 to 79, plus 82%. So again, you can see right away you have a big jump, a big increase in manufacturing in the 50s, a slowing down in the 60s. A lot of this, if you could have figures from 60 to 65, probably might be much lower. And the 70s, bouncing up again to a big increase. Okay, so this is just one indication. A lot of things, but I'll just give you a few. Pig iron production, very important. By the way, about half the pig iron went into building of railroads in this period. Railroad lines and railroad cars or whatever. Railroad track. Let's see. Okay, 1850 to 60 increased about 20%. Okay. From 1860 to 65, it increased by 1% and virtually stayed the same. And from 1865 to 70, pig iron production went up by 100%. And from 1870 to 80, went up by 130%. So the big industrial boom, as we'll see later, took place after the Civil War. But also, even in the 50s, it was quite substantial. And the Civil War everything got retarded. All real capital investment gets slowed down. Cotton textiles, another important manufacturing in that period. This is a cotton consumed in manufacturing, which really means raw cotton consumed in textile manufacture. Okay, that's the figures we've got. 1850 to 60, it was up by 47%. 1860 to 70, down by 6%. Obviously, almost all during the Civil War period. And 1870 to 80, up by about 48%. So once again, we have a consistent pattern. We have a big increase in the 50s, a slowing down, even getting declining in the 60s and going up again in the 70s. And it's almost all the statistics we have the same kind of pattern. And when all the statistics sort of confirm each other, it gets a pretty firm conclusion. Same thing happened with farm machinery manufacturing and construction and various indexes of business activity. All these things work in about the same way. The other interesting thing, by the way, this is something completely different about prices, which we'll get back to. Prices, this is something which is almost impossible for us to comprehend. Because nowadays we think of prices as going up every year. We think inflation is liquid and it only goes up by 3%. Well, nonsense. Because what we used to is in the 70s, prices were going up by about 14, 15%, 10, 20% every year. So when it goes down and it only increases by 3-4%, we think inflation is liquid. It's not true. In the old days, prices used to go down every year. Prices used to fall by about 3% a year. It was magnificent. And the reason is because supply of goods and services went up. As you have an industrial revolution, supply of goods increases, production increases, prices fall. Here we bring in some fundamental economics. If you're taking a little micro, you should grasp it. You have your good old supply and demand curve, which is the most important single thing to take out of micro. You have price on the y-axis, and you have quantity on the x-axis, and you have a demand curve, something like that, a supply line, which is vertical at any given point. As the supply of goods and services increases every year, prices are supposed to fall. And since overall, as a progressing economy, a prosperous economy, especially in the 19th century, prices, supply, even now, supply of goods and services keep going up. Why aren't prices falling? Prices are supposed to fall. And in the old days, they used to fall all the time. Every year they fell. It was magnificent for the average person. It meant that usually wages remained about the same, the average wage, and the cost of living kept going down every year, about 3% a year or something. So everybody knew in their heart and soul and gut that if they save money, the value of the savings will go up. It won't be wiped out by inflation. It will go up because of deflation. And so it did not have a depressing effect on business. Many historians think it must have been a depression. It wasn't a depression because costs also fell. In other words, productivity went up as capital equipment and technology improved and capital equipment was invested. Supply of goods and services went up. Costs went down, and so prices fell, costs fell, and profits remained okay. Profits were not wiped out. Everybody was happy. The average consumer improved, etc., etc. So this was the normal condition of the American economy from about 1800 to about 1940. From 1800 to 1940, prices fell every year, with one exception. And the exception was wartime. In other words, by the way, in England, in the great period of the Industrial Revolution in England, from about 1750 to about 1900, prices fell every year too. That wasn't, and except during wartime. Get wartime, okay, means the government needs money fast. How are they going to get money? They create money by inflation. They print money one way or the other. Print bank credit, various technical ways. The basic thing is they print money. As they print money to finance the war effort, the supply of money goes up and the demand curves go up. In other words, everybody's got more money in their pocket and they bid up prices. And so as the demand curve goes up, if you have print a lot of money, you can offset the increase in productivity. That's what happened. Precisely what happened when? War of 1812. The Mexican War was too short this to happen, too limited. Civil War, an enormous increase in money supply, both north and south. World War I and World War II. And this whole period, and all other times, except for 1896 to 1914, was for special reasons we'll get to later, when prices went up slowly, about 2% a year. Aside from that, prices fell all the time during all this period except during wartime. And the war, of course, was fairly short. Like, for example, a lot of jerks now who are Reagan administration apologists. Reagan administration is faced, the economists for Reagan administration or apologists are faced with an interesting problem. Namely, Reagan promised to balance the budget by 1984. It's now 1986. And the deficit is about $200 billion a year and going up. I mean, they keep saying, well, it's going to go down 150 million. Don't you believe it? Okay, so the deficit is enormous every year. So how do you justify that? Somebody's got to, you got to come up with some kind of justification if you're a Reagan administration apologist, either actually working for it or spiritually working for it. So they say, well, after all, it's not so bad if you take the proportion of the GNP. Deficits aren't that bad. It's only 5%. It was higher in World War II. In other words, deficits in World War II, since the GNP was lower, national income was lower, proportion of the deficit to GNP was high at 7% or whatever. Well, that's true. However, it's not much of an argument, because the World War II deficit only lasted for about 2 years. It was a big burst of tremendous war financing. It was 1943 and 44 or 45. That was it. And was known by everybody knew it was only a couple of years. This damn thing is permanent. It's a very different situation to have a burst of a deficit, as used to happen every war, and then you try to wash it out afterward. Very different from that to having a permanent deficit and leaning back and saying, there's nothing wrong with it. It was worse than World War II. That's the problem with that argument. At any rate, so prices used to fall all the time. As a result, prices around 1940 were about the same, and this is very rough, about the same as they were in 1814. There wasn't really that much difference. There was fluctuations in war, and after war was over, it would fall again. It would more or less pick up. So prices were fairly constant over a long period, because you have war prices falling in peacetime, punctuated by increases in war, and so you wind up something like that. And falling prices are good from any point of view, the point of view of the consumer, the point of view of economic health, and whatever. Any rate, to pick up on this, prices were about constant. I'm giving you wholesale prices now, to give you an idea. They fell in the 1840s. They went up a bit, 1850. So between 1840 and 1860, they were flat. Constant. Okay. 1840 to 60, constant prices. Again, this is a rough thing, but you don't need precision for this. 1860 to 65, because of the tremendous inflationary policy, so-called greenbacks I mentioned last time, prices went up by 99%. In greenbacks, see, one interesting thing about that period was that you could use gold. They didn't outlaw the use of gold. And in California and Oregon, where they discovered gold fairly recently, they were using gold coin in trade. So if you want to know, if the average person wanted to know what the cause of inflation, they could obviously see that the prices were doubling. Okay? They could see what it was, because if they took a paper dollar, if they went to buy a loaf of bread or something, if it cost $2 in greenbacks, it cost only $1 in gold, it was obvious what the reason was. They couldn't blame it on speculators or capitalists or unions or anything like that, or aliens or speculators. It's obvious what the cause was. The cause was the goddamn paper. Okay? There's something wrong with the paper money. What was wrong was it kept increasing all the time. At any rate, from 1860 to 70, the increase was 46%. In other words, prices began to fall as soon as the Civil War was over. So if you take just this half decade, you have a doubling of prices. If you take the whole decade, you have only going up by 50%. So it goes down, starts going down as soon as the war is over. In the 1870s, 1870 to 80, prices fell by 26%. What a magnificent thing. 2.5% fall per year. Money supply kept going up for various machinations, but the increase in production was so great that it offset all the manipulations of the banks and so forth, and you have a fall in prices. In the 1880s, 1880 to 1890, you had a drop of 18%. And many historians looking at this say, gee, it was a big depression in the 1870s. It wasn't a depression. Everybody loved it. There was a fall in prices. There was a fall in costs. Everybody was happy. Yet the myth of the secular depression, the reason historians are now thinking of prices going up all the time, think something wrong if prices fall. These are the depression. It doesn't mean that at all. And there's a little bit of stuff has been done on this in England, but so far in the United States there hasn't been much recasting of this in the light of the facts. But at any rate, it was just great stuff and magnificent. Someday it might come again. Falling prices. Okay, I'm going to get now to the land question. The key question for that epoch. It's a key question, by the way, for all of the so-called third world. which we have fortunately escaped for various almost accidental reasons. First you start with this. The third world model, this is obviously not true of every country, but basically it's true in most countries in South America, most countries in Asia. The model is this: you have peasants. Okay? Peasants are working the land. Happy peasants with their native costumes, all right? And they're making a living, all that. They're in fairly good shape. And all of a sudden, a foreign government comes in and conquers this land. And why does foreign government conquer anything? What's the point? Well, as the usual historian, the usual historical views that they do it for glory, for national sovereignty. I wouldn't say that's totally unimportant, but it's mostly nonsense. They do it for loot. Okay? In other words, in the case of South America, you have Indians who are peasants who are tilling the land. The Spanish come in, conquistadores. They take over. They not only establish a government there, they also parcel out the land, the key thing which is historians mostly overlook. They take, 40 warlords or something, 40 big shots in the Spanish army or the Spanish imperial regime. And they parcel out the land between 40 people, right? So they have huge landed estates. The problem is not the size of the landed estate. The problem is you got the peasants there who thought they owned the property. All of a sudden they find, bingo, they don't own it anymore. In fact, they have to pay rent to land. People call themselves landlords. And it's as if, I'll give you my favorite analogy is, it's as if the Rockefeller family suddenly announced, we own all of New York State, okay, the land in New York. And the government passes a law. In the old days, Nelson was the governor. They pass a law saying from now on, the Rockefeller family owns the entire territory of New York State. So from now on, we have to pay not only the crummy taxes we pay, which are enormous, of course, in New York, we also have to pay rent, huge amount of rent to the Rockefeller family who declare themselves the landowners. This is basically what happens in most countries, except it's mostly foreigners that come in. Okay. So in the United States, this would be probably, even now, would be considered unconstitutional to pass such a law, but in most countries, they haven't got a constitution, and you don't worry about that. So what you have is all of a sudden you turn around, and by God, you got to pay land rent. Also, in Latin, this is the origin of the so-called peasant problem. Okay? The peasants, it's not a peasants thought they were landowners. All of a sudden, they find they have to pay. And if you're an intelligent landowner, what you do is you squeeze the peasants to the limit. You're sort of like a slave owner. You take the peasant, you figure you can't tax all of his income and rent because he'd starve. You charge him enough rent to permit him to continue living and to continue to raise a family. That's basically, in other words, you tax. It's a rent tax over and above subsistence. You siphon off the landlords and build big palaces, and also they have to have a little army there to enforce this. So what you've got, this is not, I'm not talking about landlords in the United States, but fortunately we've escaped this problem, as we'll see in next time, I guess. Maybe this time. What you've got is an enforced theft of property on a massive scale, with stolen by the foreign government, which then parcels out the property to Lopez, Gonzalez, or whatever. Okay? And they suddenly find you have to pay rent for these people, plus the fact you have to pay taxes. So the same set, the government is usually an executive committee of these landlords. So what you have, you pay to the same group of people high taxes to support this whole thing, plus high rent. That's the peasant problem. Now, it's interesting when Marxist-Leninist movements, the Marxist theory is that the revolution would take place in the most advanced capitalist countries. The proletariat would rise up and take over. There has been no communist revolution in any capitalist country. Okay? All the communist revolutions have taken place in peasant countries, third world peasant countries, including Russia, 1917, which is essentially a peasant country then. And of course, China and Cuba and whatever, Vietnam, all these countries are peasant countries. And the problem was a peasant problem. It had nothing to do with the proletariat. The peasants were being shafted, in the case of Vietnam, by the French who came in about 1890s, 1880s, and seized the land and parceled it out to various French landlords, and also Vietnamese allies, the so-called compradores in Marxist terminology. So you've got, and when the peasants were rebelling in Vietnam and China and in Cuba, they were rebelling basically against these landlords. They figured they really own the land. They were private property people. They hadn't read Das Kapital. They didn't know from communism or anything. They wanted their property back. That was the whole key to these communist revolutions. They were not interested in communism. They just want to get their properties. That's the peasant problem. Interestingly enough, in Vietnam, after the North Vietnamese made the Treaty of Geneva in 1954, they were willing to abandon the South. They said, all right, we have our northern, this is the theory of peaceful coexistence, we'll hold up on the north and hold on the South. The peasants in the South, as soon as the Americans came back there, they started reinstalling the French and other Vietnamese landlords. So they sent around to each village tax collectors and rent collectors, both of whom were hated on site because they figure they own their own. Nobody likes tax collectors. Right? In addition to that, you got the rent collectors for property which they felt they owned, and rightly so. So what happened was, it had nothing to do with communism at first. What happened was the South Vietnamese villagers started forming little guerrilla bands and popping off the rent collectors and tax collectors. They come around, you shoot them. That was the first response. And they started shooting more. The government would send more. And finally, they told the communists, look, if you don't join our... Communists were trying to shush them up at the beginning. I mean, this violates the peaceful coexistence policy. They said, look, fellas, you claim you're on our side, you're in favor of the peasants. Either sign up or ship out. And so the communists then, of course, signed up. And being better organized and being aided by the North, they finally took over. But the initial impetus for the Vietnamese revolution was a pure peasant question, nothing to do with communism or Marxism or anything like that. All right, so we have the poor peasants being shafted by, it's called feudal land system. It's probably a bad term. I don't know what better term to use for it. State-imposed land ownership. In the United States, we escaped feudal land for this reason. We had a lot of land. First of all, in the United States, America's discovery, you have a huge amount of empty land. Enormous. Hundreds of millions of acres of not very productive land with nobody on it. Nobody except Indians, of course. Now, there's a controversy about how many Indians there were of that. Many of them got wiped out by disease because when they met the whites, they interchanged diseases. And most of them got wiped out. But at any rate, the Indians were unfortunately not considered human. It was the general policy of the white colonialists, and so they were suddenly basically exterminated. And aside from that, it was an empty land situation. There wasn't very densely populated even with the Indians. At any rate, so you have unused land which is not going into use yet. Who owns it? First question is, who owns this land? Well, the peasants, we know who own it. The peasants owned it, and then the feudalists came over and took it over. Okay, but with unowned land, with this vast country, all right, who owns it? Well, you have two theories of this. The libertarian theory, which essentially was adopted by Jefferson and Jackson. I mentioned the Democratic Party position. The libertarian theory is nobody owns it. It's unowned. And this is essentially the Jefferson position, essentially the Jackson position. Okay. So who should own it? The libertarian theory is nobody owns it until somebody settles it. Somebody settles it and does something with it, bringing it into production. Now what it is could be fuzzy, but it really isn't in practice. You clear the land, you grow something on it, whatever it is, chop a tree down, you build a road, whatever the heck it is, you then own it. You become a homestead owner. This is called homesteading theory. John Locke was the first theoretician of this. And it's the sort of theory which is sort of common sensey, which most people in practice will adopt. Interestingly enough, for example, in the California gold rush, in 1848, there was no government in California. The United States government technically owned it, but wasn't interested. It was way the hell out there. There was a lot of Indians in between. Nobody wanted to schlep to California. Don't forget, there was no interstate highway program, no airplanes. There was no interstate highway program, no railroads. There's no nothing. And I mentioned something, somebody mentioned the covered wagon last hour. I have great reverence for the covered wagon people. If anybody's ever driven if any of you ever drive to California, driven to it, it is a mess. It is a boring mess. From about the edge of Iowa, from the Iowa-Nebraska border until the California border, even beyond that, 2,000 miles, there's nothing there. Nothing. There's no houses, there's no people, there's no trees. There's nothing. Now, this is a slight exaggeration, but not much. Okay? These people were doing that with no roads, no motels, okay? And how they did it, Lord knows, the covered wagon types. But at any rate, it was a tremendous, I take my hat off. They're a real pioneer spirit. What you see in the movies is nothing compared to what actually they went through. At any rate, so California had no government. It was anarchy. So the miners got out there, a whole bunch of gold miners, prospecting. They had to make decisions on the spot. Who owns what? And they made it very interesting. They created their own property law. There was no mining property law. They created it. They were mostly illiterate. They did it because they knew what was going on. They knew, well, let's see, Jake has this vein, and therefore Jake owns whatever the technological unit is. You say, in other words, he owns this vein plus X number of feet around it or whatever. I don't know anything about gold mines, but they did. And so they were able to assign, without too much trouble, create a property law for gold mining. And they had courts, they had their own private courts, the miners set up, arbitrate all this and enforce it. Claim jumpers, the so-called claim jumper was a terrible crime in those days. If somebody jumped a claim, he was ridden out of town or shot or something. So it worked pretty well, and it took about 10 years for the U.S. government to get interested in this. So these things can be worked out in practice. The people who are doing it can allocate property on a homesteading basis. Whoever uses it, finds it, claims it, does something with it, becomes the owner. That's the libertarian theory. The libertarian theory is nobody owns it until it's homesteaded. The other theory, which is essentially the central government owns it. Since the central government was around then, they of course took over immediately. When America was discovered, the Spanish government owns half the globe, and the Portuguese government. They were all parceling out land without having been there even. And so this is the basic distinction here, as the central government puts claims to it. Now, once the government claimed they owned it, there's nothing much libertarians could do about it. They're stuck with this government owning it. For example, how did this state get to be called New York? It's called New York because Charles II, I believe, King of England, we were owned by England, parceled out the territory now called New York to his brother, the Duke of York. Okay, became the private owner of this whole country. I mentioned Rockefeller. You probably thought it was an exaggeration. Exactly what happened. The Duke of York privately owned this whole state. So the thing which saved us from feudal land rent, the reason why we don't have to pay half of our income to the Duke of York's descendants, because he wanted money. I mean, here's this godforsaken area here with no people and lots of trees. He wanted to get money out of it. Okay, so in order to get money out of it, the feudal landlords of New York and North Carolina, etc., parceled it out into small plots and sold it to settlers. And so that way homesteading came about in the long run. In other words, the settlers finally wound up, even though they had to pay a high price for it, they finally got out from under the feudal land system, or land monopoly system, whichever way you want to call it. So we had a way out, which unfortunately other countries don't have, because there was such a large amount of land and so few people. And so land became a drug on the market, so to speak, and they were willing to sell it off in small parcels to get any money out of it they could. I mean, the Duke of York was not really interested in the fact, he wasn't thinking about the fact in 1980 his descendants could make a lot of money out of New York. I mean, it was 1680. It was just a bunch of trees and no people. He wanted some people here. In order to get people here, he had to subdivide the land into small plots and sell it to settlers. Okay, so we had then, as the United States acquired the West, and the original 13 states in pretty good shape, except for slavery, of course, whereas plantations became large, unnaturally large because of cheap labor. Except from that, it was a fairly good land system because it was essentially acquired by settlers as the government then owns it. In other words, as the United States became a republic, the U.S. government owned all unused land, the so-called public domain, just by virtue of the fact they were government. But in the East, the land had already been fairly well parceled out. The problem came west of the Appalachians when first of all, after the Revolution, we got all this unused land. And then after the Civil War, of course, we get more and more of this. You have all this land in the West owned by the federal government. Aside from the fact the federal government is not a very shrewd or efficient landowner, to say the least, as with everything else, they had different principles. Then it becomes a governmental question. How do we parcel out the land? How much land should go to private ownership, and how should it be done? Well, what happens is the temptation is either this government to hold on to it forever, which happened since about 1900, the so-called conservation movement. Most of the land in the western states is still owned by the federal government, held out of use, just sitting there locking up all these resources they've got. Minerals, trees, ranches. Now, sometimes they lease it out, which is a bad effect. I'll get that a little bit later on. But at any rate, central government owns it. You can either sit on it, lock it up, or you can sell it at auction or whatever, or grant it to various favored people, call it political favorites, or sell it at auction to political favorites. In other words, sell it or keep it, sell it or grant it. So that was done. Before the Civil War, there was a lot of that. Selling it at auction to speculators, not the settlers, but speculators. And the speculators would charge the settlers for it. The homesteading principle, Jackson and Jefferson, since the government already owned the land, they said, well, at least allow the homesteaders to own it. In other words, grant it to the homesteaders. The homesteaders clear a piece of land, the government should grant it to them, and that's it, without charging them for it. That's the homesteading doctrine. It's sort of the later version of the libertarian doctrine. The South was against homesteading, and the East was against homesteading, and the Westerners tended to be in favor of it, but of course the Westerners were outvoted. So the Republicans in 1863, I think, passed the homesteading law, not because they were in favor of it, because they wanted to make a deal with the West. They wanted to get support in the West, and that was their concession. Unfortunately, I was fine. Iowa was settled in a homesteading manner. Everything was done very well there. Except the problem was, as soon as you get west of Iowa, and this happened around 1870, if you ever drive there, you'll see, as soon as something drastic happens to America, and you get to west of that Iowa, namely, there's no water. Okay, the water line, what do they call it? Ain't no water. So this means that it's very dry. Okay, it means that you can have a farm in the east of the Mississippi, east of Iowa, it's a little bit west of Mississippi. An average farm could be a family farm is about 160 acres. And so the homesteading law said anybody who clears and produces 160 acres gets it. And you have to stay there for 2 years, whatever the provision was. 160 acres is fine. It's fine for cattle. You can see cattle farms up in Virginia or down here, Connecticut or something. A bunch of cattle, 20 cows, and it's sitting there in a water hole or whatever. It's great. They got a lot of grass. There ain't no grass out there. It's all scrub. You know, they have one cactus and a little bit of grass under it, and 5 miles away there's more cactus. 160-acre farm or ranch is nothing. You can't do anything on 160. You need a couple of thousand acres to do anything. There's the cattle. If you drive in the west, instead of having a bunch of cattle like you do here sitting under the shade or in the shade, there ain't no shade out there, so there's no possibility of that. What they do is he has one cow over here, and another 5 miles is another cow. Because there's no food, so they have to spread out a lot. Unfortunately, after the Civil War, the jerks who were Federal Land Bureau and Department of Interior didn't understand that. They probably never went out there. Who wants to schlep out there? They're sitting in Washington, and they didn't have air conditioning then, but they're sitting there in comfort. And so 160 acres, and that's it. They refused to expand the size of the homesteading claim. They refused to allow farms of more than 160 acres, or ranches. As a result, there was what we call land communism for about 30 years, from 1860 to 1890, all over the West. In other words, from Iowa west to the Sierras, or whatever. This whole area had no private ranches. And there's no private property there at all in land. So what they did is the sort of stuff you see in Western movies in the old days. You ever see an old Western movie on television? They're always shooting each other. Why are they shooting each other? Not shooting each other for the fun of it. It's not because they enjoyed it. It's because there was no private property. Everybody was scrambling over the water hole. Who gets this land? There's the nesters, right? There's the nesters who want to farm. There's the ranchers, who usually pictured as evil in the movies for some reason. There's the ranchers and the sheepmen. Okay, and there's whole groups of them. Each one want to get the same land. They want to get their cows to pasture on this thing or whatever. They're each fighting over the same property and they're shooting each other because they claim that. Why are they shooting? You don't have to shoot each other in the East. Why is that? It's not because not because they're evil Westerners. Because there's no private property. They didn't allow property in the public domain. They didn't allow large acreage. As a result, you have people using the property but not owning it. They're leasing it in a sense. They're using the fruits of it. They can't own the actual land. So, constant conflicts as a result. Constant war over the resources. Sheepmen come. The sheepmen, for example, one thing is if you have grass, I mean, the reason for the Dust Bowl and so forth is quite simple. If you have a bunch of grass, it's better to be able to renew it from year to year. To seed it again and so forth and so on, and not eat up the whole thing. If you own the grassland, you'll have a capital investment in it. To your interest is keep the thing going, to keep the thing productive, not to destroy the grassland. Okay? It's your own economic interest to keep up the capital value of the ranch. And so private ranchers or private foresters, they don't chop down all the trees. They might benefit in the short run, but they got a lot of trees to sell. But they haven't got any tree forest left. The capital value of their forest, the stock value, disappears. So they're interested in renewing it. Private foresters renew the trees. They chop down only a certain amount. They renew it. They plant more. Same way with grass. They don't destroy the grassland. But if you can use any trees you want or grassland you want, but you can't own it, it means there's no incentive for you to renew it. Because if you try to renew it, if you plant more grass, some other guy's cattle will eat it in 2 weeks. What's the point? You're just creating more grass for the other schmo to come in and eat your grass. There's a negative incentive to keep up the value of the property. Just the opposite. If you don't chop down the tree, some other guy will chop down the tree. So the incentive is to chop down the tree as fast as possible, because you don't have the private property in the actual resource. You only have the private property in what you can chop down today. So what you have is, you have one set of cattle. You eat as much grass as possible down to the nubbin, because if you don't do it, somebody else's cattle will do it. Same way with the sheepmen. Cattlemen always complain the sheep eat the grass down to the root or something. Well, I mean, if you had your own sheep ranch, you'd find a way to solve that problem. You wouldn't let them eat everything, whatever. That's what happened. You have a war of all against all created by the fact of land communism. There was the fact there was no private property. There's communal property in the grassland and in the ranches. No private property in an actual resource. Actually, left-wing historians then blame it on capitalism. Just the opposite. The blame for the situation is due to the fact the entire grass cover was destroyed, the forest was destroyed. The problem was not capitalism. The problem was the failure to have private property, for the government to allow private property in natural resources, and grass and forests, et cetera, et cetera. You've probably seen some movies about the barbed wire. They started fencing off them. They started seizing private property in cattle ranches by putting a barbed wire around. And then there's a whole bunch of mystique of the open range. I remember Kirk Douglas about 30 years ago had a movie which he had a phobia about barbed wire. I guess his chest was cut up on one time. He kept looking for the open range. The mystique of the open range. He said, "This place is no good. They've closed off. They fenced off everything. I'm leaving for Montana or something." Well, it's charming and romantic, but the point is, by fencing it off, they were able to have private property in ranches, and to solve this problem of constant war between the nesters, the sheepers, and the cattlemen, and they were able to start renewing the property, keeping up the capital value, maintaining it. And it was illegal until about the 1890s. In other words, they just illegally fenced it off. The hell with it. This is my property. I'm fencing it, and that's it. And when the invention of barbed wire, which is around 1870s, was much cheaper than wood. Also, there were no trees there, you understand. You can't have wooden fences in the West, there ain't no trees. So with the invention of barbed wire, they were able to go in there and just fence off and the heck with it. At any rate, this is the reason for the War of the West, the fact that there were constantly wars between the nesters and the ranchers and the sheepmen and all that. It was brought about by government intervention, by the fact the government refused to allow homesteading larger than 160 acres in dry climates where there was 160 acres is pointless. Okay, that's really the land question. I think there are. This has a application right now. There are all sorts of things with water. That one of the problems for the great water problems in the West, it's not just it's dry there. That's not the real point. The point is they steal water from one area to the other. Nobody's allowed to sell water. Nobody has private property. What they do in the western states, you have private property in certain rivers and the percentage of flow, like the first 3% or the next second 8% or whatever it is. But you can't sell your right to anybody else. In other words, the people in Los Angeles want water. The guys up here have it. They should be able to sell the right to somebody in Los Angeles. They can't do that by law. By law, the government has to do it. And so it's not done. They have a big political conflict in Sacramento between the Southerners and the Northerners. They each hate each other's guts. They threaten to secede and so on and so on. And finally what happens is they have huge federal projects where they waste billions of dollars, like the Central Arizona project right now. They wasted billions of dollars, huge amount of money to bring water from the Colorado River here to Arizona. They take this water, they sell it, the government, of course, owns it, the government sells it very cheaply to farmers. In other words, the cost of the taxpayer, I don't know, X amount of dollars per gallon. They sell it to the farmers about 1/10 that. Thereby induce, and the farmers, by the way, have to buy it. They don't use it, they don't get it. So they have to use all this water. induces them to use a lot of water. And then they take the water and they irrigate uneconomically, growing crops which the government then pays them not to produce. In other words, they then pay them to plow under the crops. So the government buys it and stores it somewhere, finally dumps it. So there's a totally insane policy. The farmers get subsidized, the water construction people get subsidized, the taxpayers pay through the nose, and water gets wasted. In other words, here you have a very scarce water supply in the West. They deliberately induce people, they sell farmers water at a very low rate, inducing them to waste it, and then they buy the crops and burn it somewhere. So it's a totally insane policy, which benefits only politicians and their constituents. And at any rate, that's enough for today. Well, then next time we go into the railroad question.